The family that ages backward. The thick fog covered the mountains that September morning in 1901. This was not normal fog. It seemed to twist the world around it, making safe paths look dangerous and friendly shadows look scary. Dr. Thomas Harlow walked through the strange mist, carrying his medical bag tightly. He was going up the rough dirt road to the Ashwood farm. A young man on a horse had come to his house in the middle of the night. Elijah Ashwood had wild eyes and shaking hands when he appeared at Thomas's door. "My wife," he said, breathing hard. "Sarah is having her baby, but something is very wrong, document." The woman helping her. She ran away screaming, "Please, you have to help us." Thomas had helped deliver many difficult babies in his 15 years working with the mountain families. These people lived far from towns, and sometimes they believed in old stories instead of medicine. But something in Elijah's voice, pure fear, not just worry, made the hair on Thomas's neck stand up. The Ashwoods were new to the area. They had moved from the south just 2 years ago. They kept to themselves like many mountain people did. But there was something about them that made the local people uncomfortable. People whispered stories at church and at the store, stories about strange lights from their cabin at night, about farm animals that would not go near their land, about plants that died when Elijah's shadow passed over them. Thomas had thought this talk was just the usual fear people had of strangers. But now, as he got closer to the faraway cabin, those stories came back to his mind like dead bodies floating up in water. The small farm appeared when the path reached the top of a hill. It was a simple log cabin with a stone chimney, like many others in these mountains. Thin smoke came from the chimney and disappeared into the fog. The cleared land around it had been cared for recently, vegetable gardens on one side, a small barn on the other. Everything looked normal, but Thomas could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. His horse made nervous sounds and would not go any further. Thomas got off his horse with a tired sigh and tied the scared animal to a fence post. "Won't be long, girl," he said quietly, though he hoped this was true rather than believing it. As he walked toward the cabin door, a woman's painful screams cut through the morning quiet, followed by a man's desperate pleas. Thomas walked faster and knocked hard on the wooden door. The door opened right away, showing Elijah's tired face. The young man could not have been more than 25, but he looked much older because of the horror and exhaustion on his face. "Thank God you came," Elijah said, bringing the doctor inside. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit by oil lamps and a small fire. It was clean but had few things: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, a few shelves with jars and supplies. A curtain separated the main room from what Thomas guessed was the bedroom, where Sarah's pained cries came from. "She's been in labor since yesterday," Elijah explained, his voice barely heard over his wife's screams. Everything seemed normal at first. Martha Wilkins was helping her. "She's delivered half the babies around here." But then, his voice stopped and he looked fearfully toward the curtained doorway. "Then what, Mr. Ashwood?" Thomas asked, already taking off his coat and rolling up his sleeves. Martha looked. She just looked between Sarah's legs and started praying and crying. Then she gathered her things and ran out, saying she wouldn't be part of an evil thing. Elijah's voice cracked. "Doc, what could that mean? What's happening to my Sarah?" Thomas had no answer. "Let me see your wife," he said instead, picking up his medical bag and moving toward the curtain. The scene that met him was controlled chaos. Sarah Ashwood lay on a simple bed, her nightgown soaked with sweat, her red face twisted in pain. She was a small woman, probably no more than 20, with red hair stuck to her forehead and neck. Her belly stuck out under the thin fabric of her gown, moving with strange waves as another contraction took her. "Mrs. Ashwood, I'm Dr. Harlow," Thomas said calmly, coming to the bedside. "I'm going to help you. Your baby is coming. But I need you to try to breathe slowly and deeply for me." Sarah's eyes, glazed with pain, focused on him for a moment. "Doc," she gasped. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. This isn't like when I had Emma." Thomas looked around. "Your daughter? Where is she now?" "Sent her to my sister's yesterday," Sarah managed between breaths. "Didn't want her here for the birth." Thomas nodded as he washed his hands in a basin by the bed. A wise decision. Now, let me see how far along you are. As he positioned himself at the foot of the bed and lifted the sheet, Thomas prepared himself for the usual sights of childbirth, perhaps a breech birth or a cord problem that had scared the midwife. What he saw instead made his heart skip a beat. Coming out between Sarah's legs was not the smooth dome of a baby's head, but what looked like a fully formed human face, wrinkled and aged, with thin white hair. The face of an old man, impossibly small but perfectly shaped, was being born into the world. Thomas pulled back suddenly, almost knocking over the wash basin. "Dear God in heaven," he whispered, crossing himself even though he had not been to church in years. "What?" Elijah demanded, stepping closer. "What is it? What's wrong with our baby?" Before Thomas could answer, Sarah let out a final deep scream, and with a rush of fluid, the impossible baby slid into Thomas's shaking hands. It was a fully formed male child, but one that looked like a man in his 80s or 90s, skin loose and wrinkled, sparse white hair on his head, cloudy blue eyes blinking up with an awareness no newborn should have. And then, impossibly, the child opened its mouth and spoke. Not the cry of a newborn, but a raspy, wheezing sound that formed clear words. "Cold. So cold." Thomas almost dropped the baby. His medical training was the only thing that kept him from running away like the midwife had done. The child was small, the size of a normal newborn, but everything else about him went against nature and science. As he cut the umbilical cord with trembling hands, Thomas noticed the baby's fingers were bent with arthritis, his joints swollen and crooked. What is it?" Sarah whispered from the bed, trying to sit up. "Why isn't my baby crying? Elijah, let me see my child." Elijah stood frozen in the doorway, his face drained of all color. "That ain't no baby," he whispered. That's... It's a boy," Thomas managed to say, wrapping the baby in clean cloths, partly to warm the child and partly to hide the disturbing appearance from the parents. He's breathing well, but he's unusual, Mrs. Ashwood. I've never seen anything like it." "Give him to me," Sarah demanded, holding out her arms. "Give me my son." Thomas hesitated, his medical training fighting with his instinct to protect the new mother from shock. But in that moment of hesitation, the bundled baby began to make a sound, not crying, but a low, rhythmic humming, almost like a lullaby, but with no recognizable tune. The sound was somehow worse than if the child had stayed silent. "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. "He needs his mother." With reluctance, Thomas placed the wrapped baby in Sarah's arms, carefully arranging the blanket so that only the smallest part of the wrinkled face was visible. Sarah pulled back the cloth immediately, her eyes widening as she saw her son's face. Thomas prepared himself for screams, for rejection, for hysteria. Instead, Sarah's face softened with a mother's love. "He has your father's eyes, Elijah," she said softly, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's wrinkled cheek. "He's perfect." Elijah approached slowly, as if drawn against his will. When he looked down at his son, many emotions crossed his face: disgust, fear, confusion, and finally a reluctant tenderness. "He does it that," he admitted, his voice thick. What should we call him?" "Jeremiah," Sarah said without hesitation. "After your grandfather." Thomas watched this exchange with growing confusion. The parents were accepting this strange baby with far more calm than seemed possible. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashwood," he began carefully, "I must tell you that your son needs special medical attention. There appears to be some sort of condition affecting his development. I've never seen anything like it, but perhaps specialists in Baltimore or Philadelphia might." "No." Elijah's voice was firm, though his eyes never left his son's face. "No doctors, no specialists. Jeremiah stays here with us." "But sir, your child's condition." "Ain't no condition, document." Something in Elijah's tone made Thomas fall silent. "It's just our family way. Ashwood men are born in the twilight and work their way toward the dawn." He finally looked up at Thomas, his eyes dark with generations of secrets. "You understand what I'm saying?" Thomas didn't. Not really. But something deep inside him warned against asking more questions. "I see," he said. "Well, at the very least, let me check the baby's vital signs and make sure Mrs. Ashwood is recovering properly." As Thomas examined the child, he found to his amazement that the heartbeat and breathing were those of a healthy newborn, despite the aged appearance. He noted other strange things. The baby's eyes followed movement with the awareness of an adult. His gnarled hands gripped with surprising strength, and most disturbing of all, there was an intelligence behind those cloudy blue eyes that seemed to be studying Thomas just as carefully as he was examining the child. When he had finished, Thomas packed his instruments with unsteady hands. "Your son appears to be physically stable, despite his appearance. Mrs. Ashwood, you should rest and drink plenty of fluids. I'll return tomorrow to check on you both." As Thomas turned to leave, Elijah caught his arm. "Doc," he said quietly, "what happens in this house? It needs to stay in this house. Folks around here wouldn't understand. They'd call my boy a demon or worse." The threat was clear, though not spoken directly. Thomas nodded slowly. "Doctor-patient confidentiality is sacred, Mr. Ashwood. I won't speak of this to anyone." "See that you don't." Elijah released his arm. "Some secrets ain't meant to be shared." As Thomas rode back down the mountain, the morning mist finally burning away beneath the strengthening sun, he tried to make sense of what he had witnessed. A child born as an old man, it went against everything he had learned in medical school, everything he thought he knew about the natural world. And yet, the Ashwoods had received this miracle or curse with a strange resignation, as if it were expected. "Born in the twilight and work their way toward the dawn," Elijah had said. What could that possibly mean? Thomas did not know that this question would consume the next 20 years of his life, drawing him deeper into the mystery of the Ashwood family and their impossible secret. A secret that would eventually threaten his sanity, his reputation, and very nearly his life. The child who grew younger. As autumn came to the mountains, painting the forests in shades of fire and gold, Thomas found himself returning to the Ashwood cabin far more often than necessary for normal afterbirth care. Each visit revealed new impossibilities that both terrified and fascinated him. By October, barely a month after his birth, Jeremiah Ashwood had begun to change. The wrinkles on his face seemed less deep. The arthritis in his fingers was less severe. His cloudy eyes had cleared somewhat, revealing a startling blue that seemed to see right through whoever they looked at. Most remarkably, the baby, if such a term could still apply, had begun to speak in complete sentences, his voice still raspy but stronger. "Good day, doctor." The child had greeted him on his fourth visit, causing Thomas to drop his stethoscope in shock. "Mother says my lungs need examining today." Sarah had smiled apologetically at Thomas's stunned expression. "He learns quick," she had explained, as if that could possibly account for a 1-month-old child speaking like an educated adult. By December, when the mountains lay covered in snow and the journey to the Ashwood homestead became dangerous, Jeremiah appeared to have aged backward from a man in his 90s to one in his 70s. His hair, still white, had grown thicker, and he could sit up without support. More disturbing still, he had begun to keep a journal, his gnarled hands carefully guiding a pencil across the pages of a leather book Elijah had bought for him. "What are you writing?" Thomas had asked during his December visit, curiosity overcoming his unease. Jeremiah had fixed those strange blue eyes on him. "Memories," the child had replied. "They fade quickly at my age, you see. I must record them before they slip away entirely." Memories. What memories could a 3-month-old possibly have? Yet Thomas had glimpsed the pages filled with tiny, precise handwriting that detailed events and people he couldn't possibly have known. With each visit, Thomas's scientific mind struggled to understand what he was witnessing. He began keeping his own journal, documenting Jeremiah's impossible development with clinical precision, while searching medical texts for any precedent, any explanation that might make sense of the Ashwood mystery. He found nothing, of course. How could he? What was happening in that isolated cabin violated every natural law he had been taught to respect. By the spring of 1902, Jeremiah appeared to be a man in his 60s, still white-haired and lined, but stronger, more vibrant. He moved about the cabin freely, reading hungrily from the small collection of books Elijah brought for him, and engaging Thomas in discussions of medicine, philosophy, and history with a knowledge that far exceeded anything he could have learned in his short life. "How do you know these things?" Thomas finally asked directly, after Jeremiah had corrected him on a point of ancient Greek medical practice. "How can you possibly know about Hippocrates' teachings on bodily humors?" Jeremiah had smiled mysteriously, looking for all the world like a wise elder, despite his child-sized body. "Some knowledge is carried in the blood, doctor. The Ashwood blood remembers." It was around this time that Thomas began to notice the odd relationships within the Ashwood family. Sarah treated Jeremiah as one would expect a mother to treat her child, with tenderness, protection, and affection. Elijah, however, interacted with his son as if he were an elder relative deserving of respect and deference. He consulted Jeremiah on matters of the farm, on decisions about planting and building, listening carefully to the child's advice. Emma, the Ashwood's 4-year-old daughter, who had returned from her aunt's after the birth, seemed entirely untroubled by her unusual brother. She played with him as any sister might, though their games often involved Jeremiah teaching her letters and numbers with the patience of an experienced teacher. As for the locals, the Ashwoods had maintained their isolation, turning away any neighborly inquiries about their new child. Rumors had spread, of course rumors that Thomas, true to his word, neither confirmed nor denied. Some said the Ashwood baby had died and been replaced by a changeling. Others claimed the child had been born deformed and was kept hidden away. A few even whispered that Sarah had given birth to the devil himself. Thomas might have dismissed such talk as superstitious nonsense 6 months earlier. Now he wasn't so sure, not about the devil, he remained a man of science despite everything, but about the fundamental wrongness of what was happening in that cabin. The breaking point came in late April, when Thomas arrived for his monthly visit to find the Ashwood homestead in a state of controlled chaos. Sarah was packing trunks, Emma was gathering her toys, and Elijah was hitching horses to a large wagon already loaded with furniture and supplies. "You're leaving?" Thomas stated, getting off his horse. Elijah nodded curtly. "Time to move on. We've stayed too long as it is." "But why? Your farm is just beginning to establish itself." "Jeremiah is why we're leaving," came a voice from the cabin doorway. The boy himself stood there, now appearing to be a man in his late 50s. His once white hair was peppered with black, his stance straighter, his eyes clearer. Too many questions. Too many curious eyes. "Isn't that right, Father?" Elijah looked away. "We always move on when the questions start. It's safer that way." "Safer for whom?" Thomas demanded. "Mr. Ashwood, as your doctor and your friend, I must insist you reconsider. Jeremiah's condition requires study, documentation. He could advance our understanding of human development, of aging itself." "He ain't a specimen for your microscope, Doc," Elijah said sharply. "He's my son. A son who was born old and is growing younger by the day," Thomas pressed. "Surely you see how unprecedented this is? How valuable to science." "Science," Jeremiah said, the word dripping with centuries of scorn from his childish lips. "Always wanting to cut open what it doesn't understand, to label and categorize and ultimately destroy." He approached Thomas with the steady walk of a middle-aged man, though he barely reached the doctor's waist in height. "Tell me, Dr. Harlow, what would your colleagues do if they discovered me? Would they treat me as a human being, or as a curiosity to be examined, dissected, and displayed?" Thomas had no answer. He knew too well the ruthlessness of scientific inquiry when faced with anomalies. "We're leaving at first light," Elijah said with finality. "Heading west. These mountains have been good to us, but it's time." "And what about your next child?" Thomas asked, noting Sarah's slightly swollen belly. "Sarah is with child again, is she not?" Sarah's hand moved protectively to her stomach, confirming Thomas's suspicion. He had noticed the signs during his last visit, the subtle changes in her complexion, the fullness in her breasts. "That's partly why we need to go now," she said softly. Can't have the same midwife seeing another Ashwood boy born. So it will be the same, Thomas whispered. Another child like Jeremiah. If it's a boy, Elijah confirmed. All Ashwood men are born at the end of their lives. It's been our way since. He stopped abruptly. Since when? Thomas pressed. How long has this been happening to your family? A heavy silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the soft nickering of the horses and Emma's distant humming as she played. Finally, it was Jeremiah who spoke. Since 1704, he said, his voice carrying the weight of long-buried history. Since Absalom Ashwood made a bargain he didn't fully understand, on the shores of a lake that no longer exists. Jeremiah, Elijah warned. Some stories ain't for sharing. The boy-man looked up at his father with ancient eyes. He deserves to know, Father, after all he's done for us. He turned back to Thomas. Would you like to hear our story, Doctor? The true story of the Ashwood curse? It may be your only chance. Against every rational instinct, Thomas found himself nodding. Yes, he said, his scientific curiosity overpowering his growing fear. I would. Jeremiah smiled, a gesture that transformed his aging face into something almost boyish. Then come inside, Dr. Harlow. We have until dawn. The origin of the curse. The interior of the Ashwood cabin was warm, the hearth fire casting dancing shadows across the half-empty shelves and partially dismantled furniture. Sarah had put Emma to bed in the small alcove that served as her room, and now the adults, including Jeremiah, who despite his appearance was not yet a year old, sat around the kitchen table. A bottle of corn whiskey and 4 glasses had been produced, and Elijah had poured generous measures for everyone, including his son. Thomas watched with morbid fascination as Jeremiah lifted the glass with hands that now showed only the barest hints of arthritis, swallowing the harsh liquor with the practiced ease of a man who had been drinking for decades. The beginning, Jeremiah said, setting down his glass, is, as with most curses, a tale of greed and foolishness. In 1704, my ancestor Absalom Ashwood was a young man with grand ambitions but limited prospects, the 7th son of a failing tobacco farmer in colonial Virginia. He had nothing to inherit and few skills beyond a quick mind and quicker tongue. How do you know this? Thomas interrupted. These are events from nearly 200 years ago. Jeremiah's penetrating blue eyes fixed on him. As I told you, Doctor, the Ashwood blood remembers. When an Ashwood male is born, he carries the memories of all Ashwood men before him. Faint at first, like dreams half remembered upon waking, but growing clearer as the body ages backward. Thomas took a large swallow of his own whiskey, struggling to process this new impossibility. Absalom had heard tales, Jeremiah continued, of a place deep in the wilderness beyond the frontier settlements, where an ancient power resided. The natives avoided this place, calling it the pond where time swims backward. Being young, arrogant, and desperate, Absalom set out to find this legendary location, believing he might discover gold or some other treasure to make his fortune. After months of searching, suffering hardship and near starvation, he found it, a perfectly circular pond, unnaturally still, situated in a clearing where no birds sang and no insects buzzed. The water was black as midnight, but reflected the sky with perfect clarity, creating the illusion that one could step through to another world. Jeremiah paused, taking another sip of whiskey. Thomas noticed that Elijah and Sarah were listening as intently as he was. Perhaps they too were hearing the complete story for the first time. Absalom made camp by this pond, entranced by its unnatural beauty. On the 3rd night, beneath a full moon, he witnessed something extraordinary. The surface of the pond began to ripple from the center outward, and from those ripples emerged a figure neither man nor woman, but something else entirely. It introduced itself as the caretaker of moments and asked Absalom why he had come. Truthfully, Absalom admitted his desire for wealth and status. The entity seemed amused by this mundane request and offered him a bargain. I can grant you a bloodline that will never know the fear of time's passage that haunts all men. Your descendants will walk the path that all humans secretly desire. They will move toward youth rather than decrepitude, toward strength rather than weakness, toward beginning rather than end. Like any good deal with the devil, Thomas murmured. It sounded too perfect. Jeremiah smiled thinly. Precisely, Doctor. Absalom, blinded by the prospect of cheating death itself, agreed without questioning the terms. The entity instructed him to cut his palm and let 7 drops of blood fall into the pond, 1 for each generation the curse would affect. As the blood touched the water, the entity proclaimed, "It is done. The men of your line shall be born at life's sunset and journey toward its dawn. They shall carry the wisdom of age in their infancy and the folly of youth in their twilight. This gift I grant you until 7 times 7 sons have been born to your bloodline." Absalom returned to civilization, believing he had secured immortality for his descendants. He married, established a modest farm, and eventually sired a son, only to watch in horror as his wife gave birth to a wizened, white-haired infant who spoke with the voice of an old man. The midwife fled screaming, the neighbors whispered of witchcraft, and within a month, Absalom was forced to flee with his wife and unnatural child, thus establishing the pattern that has defined the Ashwood existence for 2 centuries. Thomas leaned forward, entranced despite his scientific skepticism. And the aging backward, it continues throughout life? Jeremiah nodded. An Ashwood male is born appearing approximately 90 years old. By his first birthday, he appears to be in his 70s. By age 10, he looks to be in his 50s. By 20, he resembles a man in his 30s. By 35, he has the appearance of a teenager. And by 40? Thomas prompted when Jeremiah fell silent. It was Elijah who answered, his voice hollow. By 40, an Ashwood man looks like a young child. By 45, an infant. And by 50? Thomas continued when he couldn't. By 50, Jeremiah completed. We fade away entirely. Nothing remains. It is as if we never existed at all. A heavy silence fell over the table. Thomas's mind reeled with the implications. So you're saying that Ashwood men live only half a normal lifespan, and at the end they simply disappear? Precisely, Jeremiah confirmed. We experience our lives in reverse, physically speaking, though our minds develop normally, enhanced by the memories of our ancestors, but otherwise following the typical pattern of learning and growth. But the women? Thomas turned to Sarah. The Ashwood women are normal? Sarah nodded. The curse only affects the male line. Ashwood daughters are born and age just like any other children. It's only the sons who carry the burden. And you knew this when you married Elijah? Thomas couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. I told her everything before I proposed, Elijah said defensively. Sarah knew what she was getting into, what our sons would be. She accepted it. Sarah reached across the table to take her husband's hand. I loved Elijah enough to accept his family's uniqueness, and I love Jeremiah just as fiercely as I love Emma. Regardless of how he came into this world, Thomas turned back to Jeremiah. You mentioned 7 times 7 sons. How many have there been so far? I am the 41st, Jeremiah replied. The child Sarah carries now, if male, will be the 42nd. 5 more after that, and the curse will be lifted. Or so we believe. And no one has ever tried to break this curse? To seek out this pond again? Elijah laughed bitterly. Every generation has tried, Doctor. The pond has never been found again. It's as if it vanished from the earth after Absalom's bargain was struck. And no medical intervention has ever been attempted? Thomas pressed. No scientific investigation? Once, Jeremiah said grimly. In 1847, my great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Ashwood, was persuaded to subject himself to study by a physician in Philadelphia. Within 6 months, he was no longer a patient, but a prisoner. When his wife and children attempted to secure his release, they too were detained for examination. It took a fire that claimed half the hospital and 19 lives for the Ashwoods to escape. Since then, we have avoided doctors, present company excepted. Thomas absorbed this sobering history. So you move constantly, staying nowhere long enough for people to notice the reverse aging. Exactly, Elijah confirmed. 2 years is usually our limit in any one place. By then, the questions become too frequent, the scrutiny too intense. "Where will you go now?" Thomas asked, knowing he had no right to the information yet hoping they might trust him with it. "West," Elijah said vaguely. "There's still frontier enough to lose ourselves in new places where strangers are too busy with their own survival to pay much mind to their neighbors' peculiarities." "And this will be your life forever?" Thomas asked. "Constant flight, constant hiding?" "Until the 49th son is born," Jeremiah said. "Or until mankind becomes enlightened enough to accept what they cannot understand without seeking to control or destroy it." His voice carried the weariness of centuries. "I would not wager on the latter occurring before the former." As the night deepened, more details of the Ashwood history emerged. Tales of near discoveries, of hair's-breadth escapes, of brief periods of peace shattered by inevitably encroaching curiosity. Thomas learned that Elijah himself was now 32, appearing as a man in his late 20s though born looking ancient. He learned that Ashwood men typically married young, knowing their time was limited, and that many took their own lives rather than fade into infancy at the end. "The final years are the hardest," Jeremiah explained, his eyes distant. "To have the mind of an old man trapped in the body of a child, becoming ever more helpless, ever more dependent. Many find it unbearable." Dawn was breaking when their conversation finally exhausted itself. Thomas sat back, his mind overflowing with information that challenged everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the nature of time itself. "What will you do now, Doctor?" Elijah asked as they all rose from the table. "With what you know about us?" Thomas considered the question carefully. As a man of science, he had a responsibility to document this phenomenon, to bring it to the attention of his colleagues, to advance human knowledge. Yet as a doctor who had sworn to do no harm, and as a man who had come to care for this strange family, he knew that such exposure would doom them to the very fate they had spent centuries avoiding. "Your secret is safe with me," he said finally. "I'll record my observations in my private journal, but it will go no further than that. Not in my lifetime." Relief washed over Elijah's face. "Thank you, document. I knew you were a good man." As Thomas prepared to depart, helping the family load the last of their belongings onto the wagon, Jeremiah approached him with a small leather-bound book. "My journal," the child man explained, pressing it into Thomas's hands. "A record of my observations during my first year of life, as well as memories that have surfaced from ancestors past. Perhaps someday, when the 49th son has been born and the curse is broken, it may help explain what happened to the Ashwood men." Thomas accepted the journal reverently. "I'll safeguard it until that day comes." Jeremiah smiled, the expression transforming his middle-aged face. "I know you will, Doctor. Our paths will cross again, though you may not recognize me when they do. I'll be much changed." With those cryptic words, the boy-man climbed onto the wagon beside his mother. Elijah took the reins, and with a final nod to Thomas, set the horses in motion. The doctor watched until the wagon disappeared around a bend in the mountain path, carrying with it a family whose very existence defied everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The years of silence. True to his word, Thomas Harlow never spoke publicly about the Ashwood family or their extraordinary condition. He continued his practice in Winston County, tending to the medical needs of the mountain folk with renewed dedication, as if to atone for the secret knowledge he kept locked away. His private journals, however, filled with detailed observations and theories about the Ashwood mystery, growing to fill an entire shelf in his study. Years passed. The 20th century, still in its infancy, brought changes to the isolated Appalachian communities. Telephones appeared in general stores, automobiles occasionally braved the mountain roads, and news of the wider world filtered in through newspapers and traveling salesmen. Thomas kept abreast of medical advances, corresponding with colleagues in larger cities and attending conferences when he could, always listening for any mention of cases that might resemble the Ashwoods, always finding none. In the spring of 1908, 7 years after the Ashwoods' departure, Thomas received a letter postmarked from Montana Territory. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but when he broke the seal, he found a single sheet of paper containing just 3 lines. A sun born at sunset, journeying toward dawn, the 42nd vessel of ancient memory. We are well. J.A. Thomas understood immediately. Sarah had given birth to another son, another Ashwood male born old and destined to age backward, the 42nd of the prophesied 49. He carefully filed the letter with his journals, adding his own notation about the date and what it might mean for the Ashwood timeline. More years passed. Occasionally, similar cryptic messages would arrive from Idaho, from Oregon, from Northern California, each indicating the family's continued movement westward and updating him on Jeremiah's development. By 1912, Jeremiah would have been 11 years old and, according to the pattern, appearing as a man in his 50s. Thomas often found himself wondering what the boy man was learning, experiencing, remembering as his body grew younger while his mind matured. Then came the Great War. Thomas, though in his 50s, volunteered as a medical officer, driven by patriotic duty and a desire to use his skills where they were most needed. He served in field hospitals in France, witnessing horrors that rivaled any supernatural phenomenon. Men torn apart by machinery, poisoned by gas, driven mad by constant bombardment. In the face of such human-made devastation, the Ashwood mystery receded in his thoughts, becoming almost a comforting fantasy rather than a scientific puzzle. When Thomas returned to Winston County in 1919, changed by what he had seen and experienced, he found his practice much diminished. Younger doctors had established themselves during his absence, bringing with them modern techniques and equipment that made his own methods seem quaint by comparison. At 58, with a slight limp from a shrapnel wound and recurring nightmares of the trenches, Thomas considered retirement. It was in this state of professional uncertainty and personal malaise that a young woman appeared at his door one autumn evening. She was perhaps 20, with auburn hair and striking blue eyes that stirred a distant memory. "Dr. Harlow?" she asked hesitantly. "Dr. Thomas Harlow?" "Yes," he confirmed, studying her face for clues to her identity. "How can I help you, miss?" "Ashwood," she supplied. "Emma Ashwood." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Emma, little Emma. "But you were just a child when we left," she completed with a sad smile. "I was 4 then. I'm 22 now." Thomas brought her inside, his mind racing. "Your family? Are they with you, Jeremiah? Your parents?" Emma's expression clouded. "That's why I'm here, doctor. I need your help. It's about Jeremiah." The return of Emma. Over tea in his cluttered sitting room, Emma explained the events of the past 18 years. The Ashwoods had indeed traveled west, eventually settling in a remote valley in Northern California, where they established a small apple orchard. Isolation had provided safety, and for several years they had known a measure of peace. Jeremiah thrived, Emma said, her eyes distant with memory. By the time he was 15, he looked like a man in his 40s. He was brilliant, Dr. Harlow. He taught himself engineering, botany, music, languages, everything he could learn from books. He designed irrigation systems for the orchard that doubled our yield. People from neighboring farms would consult him on everything from sick livestock to mechanical problems, never suspecting he was just a boy. "And your parents? The baby, was it a boy?" "A boy, yes. They named him Isaiah. He's 17 now, but looks like a man in his 40s, just as Jeremiah did at his age." Emma hesitated. "Father passed 5 years ago, an accident with the cider press. Mother still runs the orchard with Isaiah's help." "I'm sorry to hear about Elijah," Thomas said sincerely. He was a good man faced with extraordinary circumstances. A thought occurred to him. Jeremiah would be 28 now. He should appear as a young man then. Emma nodded. "That's part of why I'm here. Jeremiah looks like a teenager now, perhaps 17 or 18 in normal years. But something's happened, something beyond the usual Ashwood pattern." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded paper, which she handed to Thomas. It was a pencil drawing of exceptional quality, a portrait of a handsome young man with familiar piercing eyes, his face unlined, his hair dark and full. "Jeremiah?" Thomas whispered, hardly able to reconcile this image with the elderly infant he had delivered nearly 3 decades earlier. Yes, Emma confirmed. This is from 6 months ago. He was still communicating normally then, still himself, despite his youthful appearance. But then, she paused, struggling for words. He began to change in other ways. His memories, the ancestral memories that all Ashwood men carry, began to overwhelm his own. What do you mean? He would wake screaming from nightmares of battles fought centuries ago. He would speak in languages none of us recognized. Sometimes he would address Mother as if she were his wife from a previous generation, or mistake me for a sister long dead. Emma's voice trembled. And the worst part, he began to forget his own life. His own experiences started slipping away, replaced by the flood of ancestral memory. Thomas frowned. That's not consistent with what your father and Jeremiah himself told me about the condition. The ancestral memories were supposed to complement their own experiences, not replace them. That's why I've come to you, Emma said urgently. Something's gone wrong with the pattern. Mother thinks it's because Jeremiah has been researching the curse, trying to break it before the 49th son is born. He found references to the original pond in some old tribal legends and has been corresponding with historians and anthropologists under a false name. She thinks he disturbed something that was meant to remain dormant. Where is Jeremiah now? Thomas asked, a sense of foreboding growing within him. That's the other reason I need your help. 3 weeks ago he disappeared. Left a note saying he was going to find where it all began. We believe he's coming east, trying to locate the original pond from Absalom's encounter. Emma leaned forward, her eyes pleading. Dr. Harlow, if anyone can help find him and understand what's happening to him, it's you. You're the only outsider who knows our family's secret, the only one who studied it scientifically. Thomas sat back, overwhelmed by the responsibility being placed on him. He was an old man now, well past his prime, with a medical practice barely hanging on. What Emma was asking would require resources, energy, and time he wasn't sure he possessed. And yet, the mystery that had haunted him for 18 years was suddenly active again, calling to the scientist within him who had never stopped wondering, never stopped questioning. I'll help you find your brother, he said finally. But I need to see your journals, your father's records, everything the family has documented about the condition over the years. And I'll need to examine Isaiah as well, to compare his development with what I remember of Jeremiah's. Relief washed over Emma's face. Thank you, Doctor. Mother has packed all our family records. They're waiting at the hotel. As for Isaiah, her expression grew troubled again. That may be more difficult. He didn't want me to come here. He believes that involving outsiders will only make things worse. Then we'll have to convince him otherwise, Thomas said, rising from his chair with newfound determination. Pack your things, Miss Ashwood. We leave for California as soon as possible. Journey to the west. The transcontinental journey in 1919 was far easier than it would have been when Thomas first met the Ashwoods, but it still required nearly a week of train travel, with Emma growing increasingly anxious as they progressed westward. She had received no further word from her mother about Jeremiah's whereabouts, and her fears for her brother's safety intensified with each passing day. For Thomas, the journey provided an opportunity to study the Ashwood family records Emma had brought with her. Leather-bound journals dating back to the early 1700s, each documenting the experiences of Ashwood men as they aged backward through life. The earliest volumes were written in a formal, archaic style, filled with religious references and moral self-flagellation, as the writers struggled to understand their condition as divine punishment. As the decades progressed, the tone of the journals shifted, becoming more scientific, more analytical. By the mid-1800s, Ashwood men were conducting systematic observations of their own development, measuring changes in physical capability, memory function, and appearance with remarkable objectivity. Thomas recognized in these accounts the foundation of the knowledge Jeremiah had shared with him that night in the cabin. Most fascinating were Jeremiah's own journals, beginning with the volume he had given Thomas 18 years earlier, and continuing through volumes Emma had brought. The progression of his handwriting alone told a story, starting with the shaky script of arthritic fingers and gradually becoming more fluid, more vigorous as his body grew younger. His observations were the most detailed of all, combining scientific rigor with philosophical insight. One passage, written when Jeremiah was about 20 and thus appearing as a man in his 30s, particularly caught Thomas's attention. I have begun to question whether our condition is truly a curse or merely a different way of experiencing time. All humans are born and begin a journey toward death. We Ashwood men simply travel in the opposite direction, from decrepitude toward youth. Both paths end in the same dissolution. The difference is only in the perspective with which we view the journey. Yet there is one crucial distinction. Normal men are born innocent, without knowledge, and acquire wisdom through their experiences. We Ashwoods are born with the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors, but must learn to temper it with the experiences of our own lifetime. Perhaps this is the true curse, to know too much too soon, to begin with answers rather than questions. When they finally arrived at the Ashwood orchard in Northern California, Thomas was struck by how the family had prospered despite their ongoing challenges. The property was extensive, with neat rows of apple trees stretching across gently rolling hills, a large farmhouse built of redwood, and several outbuildings including a cider press and storage barns. It spoke of 18 years of hard work and careful management. Sarah Ashwood, now in her early 40s, greeted them at the door. The years had been kind to her. Her auburn hair showed only traces of gray, and the lines around her eyes spoke more of laughter than hardship. But her expression was tense with worry as she embraced her daughter and regarded Thomas with surprise and hope. "Dr. Harlow," she said, "after all these years, Emma told me she was seeking you out, but I hardly dared believe you would come all this way. How could I not?" Thomas replied simply, "Your family situation has occupied my thoughts for nearly 2 decades." Sarah ushered them inside, where a young man waited in the parlor. At first glance, Thomas thought he was looking at Elijah as he had known him, the same strong build, the same set of the jaw. But this young man's eyes were darker, more guarded, and he regarded Thomas with open suspicion. "Isaiah," Sarah said, "this is Dr. Harlow, the physician who delivered Jeremiah." Isaiah Ashwood, 17 years old but appearing as a man in his early 40s, gave Thomas a curt nod. "Mother and Emma seem to think you can help find my brother. I remain unconvinced that involving outsiders is wise." "Isaiah," Emma began reproachfully, but Thomas raised a hand. "Your caution is understandable, Mr. Ashwood. Your family has suffered for its uniqueness in the past. But I assure you, I have kept your secret for 18 years and will continue to do so. My interest is purely in helping find Jeremiah and understanding what may be happening to him." Isaiah seemed unmoved. "And what qualifies you to understand something that has affected our family for over 2 centuries? "Nothing, perhaps," Thomas admitted. "But I do have medical training, scientific methodology, and 18 years of studying your family's journals. More importantly, I have no agenda beyond helping Jeremiah. I'm not seeking fame or fortune from your condition." Isaiah held Thomas's gaze for a long moment before relenting slightly. "We'll see. In the meantime, Mother has prepared rooms for you both. You must be tired after your journey." As Sarah showed them to their accommodations, Thomas noted the subtle signs of Jeremiah's absence throughout the house. A chair positioned at the writing desk that no one else seemed to use, bookshelves organized in a particular system, technical drawings of orchard irrigation pinned to a corkboard. Jeremiah's presence lingered in the very fabric of the household, making his physical absence all the more conspicuous. The troubling changes. That evening, after a quiet dinner during which Isaiah remained largely silent, Sarah invited Thomas to her late husband's study. The room was warm and well-appointed, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk. She poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Our own apple brandy," she explained, handing him a glass. "Elijah perfected the recipe before he passed." Thomas accepted the drink gratefully. "I was sorry to hear about your husband. He seemed a good man dealing with extraordinary circumstances." "He was," Sarah agreed, her eyes growing distant. "He knew his time would be limited, all Ashwood men do. But he packed more living into his 37 years than most men manage in twice that time." She sipped her brandy, gathering her thoughts. But you didn't come here to talk about Elijah. You want to know about Jeremiah. Emma explained some of what's been happening. The overwhelming ancestral memories, the personality changes. When did you first notice something was wrong? Sarah settled into a leather chair, gesturing for Thomas to do the same. About a year ago, Jeremiah had just turned 27, appearing as a young man of perhaps 19 or 20. He'd always been brilliant, curious, driven to understand the world and his place in it. But he became obsessed with the curse, with finding its origin and breaking it. He found references to the pond in tribal legends? Yes, he discovered that certain native tribes in the Eastern Territories had stories about a place they called the Pool of Reversed Seasons, where time flowed backward. According to their legends, it was a doorway between worlds that appeared only when the barriers between realities grew thin. Sarah's expression grew troubled. Jeremiah became convinced that the pond still exists, that it just moves, and that if he could find it again, he could negotiate with the entity to break the curse before the 49th son is born. Why would he want to break it prematurely? Wouldn't it be better to wait for the natural conclusion? Sarah shook her head. That's where the trouble lies. Jeremiah discovered something in the oldest family journals, something that had been deliberately obscured. The 49th son doesn't mark the end of the curse. He marks a choice. Thomas leaned forward. What kind of choice? According to what Jeremiah found, when the 49th Ashwood son reaches the age of 25, the entity will return and offer the family a final bargain. The curse can be broken, allowing all subsequent Ashwood men to age normally, but only if every living Ashwood male at that time willingly sacrifices the remainder of his life. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. So if the 49th son were born tomorrow and lived to 25, both Jeremiah and Isaiah would have to die to break the curse for future generations. Exactly, Sarah confirmed grimly. And the same choice has been offered to every seventh generation of Ashwood men since the curse began. Each time they've refused, allowing the curse to continue rather than sacrifice themselves. And Jeremiah doesn't want to wait for that choice to be forced upon them. No, he believes there must be another way, a way to break the curse without sacrifice. That's why he's been researching the original encounter, trying to understand the exact nature of the bargain Absalom made. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set down her glass. But the more he researched, the stranger his behavior became. He started having vivid dreams, not just memories from past Ashwoods, but visions of the entity itself, calling to him. Then 3 weeks ago, I found this on his bed. She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Thomas. The note was written in a strong, fluid hand. I've seen it in my dreams. The black water reflecting a sky that isn't ours. It's calling me back to where it all began. Don't follow. This is my journey to make alone. I'll return when the bargain is unmade. J. Thomas studied the note carefully. And you have no idea where he might have gone specifically? We believe he's heading east, trying to find the original location of the pond. But Absalom's journals are vague about exactly where he encountered it. Somewhere in what was then the Virginia colony wilderness. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. Dr. Harlow, my son is out there somewhere, possibly not even fully himself anymore, chasing a legend that has destroyed our family for generations. We have to find him before he does something irreversible. Thomas sat back, contemplating the enormity of the task before him. Finding one man in the vastness of America, especially one who didn't want to be found, seemed nearly impossible. But perhaps there were clues in the family journals, in the ancestral memories that Jeremiah carried patterns or locations that might narrow the search. I'll need to speak with Isaiah, he said finally. If the ancestral memories are passed through the male line, he may have insights into what Jeremiah is experiencing, where he might go. Sarah nodded. Isaiah has been resistant, but I'll speak with him. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. And Dr. Harlow, if we do find Jeremiah, and if he has indeed located this pond or the entity that cursed our family, what then? What are we dealing with? Is it supernatural, scientific, or something else entirely? It was the question that had haunted Thomas for 18 years, the fundamental nature of the Ashwood anomaly. As a doctor, he wanted to believe there was a medical explanation, some bizarre genetic mutation or developmental disorder. As a man who had seen the horrors of modern warfare, he knew humanity was capable of creating hells on earth that rivaled any supernatural curse. And as someone who had delivered an infant that spoke with the voice of an old man, he had to acknowledge that some things defied rational explanation. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, we'll face it together. I promise you that." Little did Thomas know that this promise would lead him into the darkest chapter of his life, a confrontation with forces beyond human understanding that would claim more than one Ashwood life before it was resolved, and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. The ancestral voice. The following week saw Thomas immersed in the Ashwood family's history more deeply than ever before. He systematically worked through their extensive archives, cross-referencing journals across generations, mapping patterns, and searching for clues to where Jeremiah might have gone. Isaiah remained distant at first, answering Thomas's questions with minimal detail, clearly uncomfortable with an outsider probing into family matters. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during dinner on Thomas's fifth evening at the orchard. They had been discussing mundane matters, apple varieties, weather patterns, local politics, when Isaiah suddenly went rigid, his fork clattering to his plate. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and his body began to tremble. "Isaiah!" Sarah cried, half rising from her chair. "Wait," Thomas cautioned, moving quickly to the young man's side. "Don't restrain him. This appears to be some sort of seizure." But it wasn't a typical seizure. Isaiah's mouth began moving, forming words without sound at first, then gradually giving voice to them in a tone and cadence entirely unlike his normal speech. "The place where waters meet but do not mix," he intoned, his voice suddenly ancient, cracked with age. "Where the river bends thrice before the mountains rise. Beneath the sentinel oak that bears no acorns. When the moon is dark and the stars speak in patterns unknown to men. That is where the door opens. That is where time runs backward." Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the episode ended. Isaiah slumped forward, and would have fallen face first into his dinner plate if Thomas hadn't caught him. After a moment he straightened, blinking in confusion. "What happened?" he asked, looking at their concerned faces. "Why are you all staring at me?" Emma explained what they had witnessed, while Thomas checked Isaiah's pulse and pupils, finding both normal. Isaiah had no recollection of speaking or of losing consciousness, but he looked deeply troubled by the experience. "It's happening to me too, then?" he said quietly. "Just as it happened to Jeremiah." "You've never experienced anything like this before?" Thomas asked. Isaiah shook his head. "I have the ancestral memories, of course, all Ashwood men do, but they've always been like distant dreams, things I could access if I concentrated. But that didn't intrude on my waking thoughts. This was different. It was as if someone else was speaking through me." "Not someone else," Thomas corrected gently. "One of your ancestors, possibly Absalom himself, given the content of what you said." That evening, after Isaiah had retired to his room to rest, Thomas, Sarah, and Emma gathered in Elijah's study to discuss what had occurred. "This confirms what was happening to Jeremiah before he left," Sarah said, pacing anxiously. "The ancestral memories becoming more dominant, more intrusive. But why now? Why both of them?" Thomas had been pondering this question since dinner. "I have a theory," he said slowly. "The Ashwood curse has existed for just over 200 years. You're approaching the end of the 7th generation, the 49th son. Perhaps as that milestone approaches, the barrier between past and present weakens for all Ashwood men, like pressure building before a storm breaks." "Exactly," Emma suggested. "And Jeremiah, being more sensitive or perhaps more actively engaged with the ancestral memories through his research, was affected first and more severely." "But what Isaiah said," Sarah pressed, "it sounded like directions to the pond. Where waters meet but do not mix, where the river bends thrice before the mountains rise. Could that help us find Jeremiah?" Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "It might. These landmarks are vague by our standards, but they would have been meaningful to someone navigating wilderness in the early 1700s. He turned to Emma. Do you have maps of the Virginia colony from that period? Or any references in the journals to specific waterways or mountains? Emma nodded eagerly. Jeremiah collected historical maps as part of his research. They're in his workshop behind the house. Jeremiah's research. Jeremiah's workshop proved to be a treasure trove of information, not just about the Ashwood curse, but about Jeremiah himself. The large converted barn was meticulously organized, with drafting tables, bookshelves, and glass-fronted cabinets containing specimens and artifacts. One entire wall was devoted to maps, ranging from reproductions of colonial-era charts to modern topographic surveys, with notes and markings in Jeremiah's precise handwriting. He was trying to triangulate the pond's location, Thomas realized, studying the maps. Look, he's identified several places where rivers meet, cross-referencing them with mountain ranges and old-growth forests that might contain this sentinel oak. He's narrowed it down. Has he? Sarah asked, hope edging into her voice. I think so. Thomas pointed to a region in western Virginia, near what was now the West Virginia border. He's circled this area repeatedly and made the most notes here. It's a remote region, even today mountainous, largely undeveloped, with several converging waterways. That's nearly 3,000 miles from here, Emma observed. If Jeremiah left 3 weeks ago, he could easily be there by now, especially if he traveled by train. We should telegraph ahead to local authorities, Thomas suggested. Ask them to keep an eye out for a young man of his description. No, Isaiah said from the doorway, startling them all. He had been so quiet entering the workshop that no one had noticed his arrival. No authorities. If Jeremiah has found the pond, the last thing we need is uninvolved strangers blundering in. This is Ashwood business. Thomas turned to face the young man. Isaiah, I understand your concern for privacy, but Jeremiah may be in danger, possibly from himself, given his mental state when he left. All the more reason why this needs to be handled within the family. Isaiah stepped fully into the workshop, his expression resolute. I'm going after him. Alone. Absolutely not, Sarah said firmly. I've already lost your father and may lose your brother. I won't risk you too. Mother, I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what must happen. Isaiah's voice was gentle but unyielding. I share Jeremiah's blood. I carry the same memories. If anyone can find him and reach him, it's me. Thomas studied the young man, physically appearing as a man in his 40s, but chronologically only 17. There was a maturity in his bearing that belied his years, a certainty that seemed to draw on generations of experience. He's right, Thomas said reluctantly. Isaiah may be our best chance of finding Jeremiah. But he added as Sarah began to protest. He shouldn't go alone. I'll accompany him. Isaiah started to object, but Thomas continued before he could speak. You need someone with medical training in case Jeremiah is ill or injured. You need someone who understands your family's condition but isn't affected by it. And frankly, young man, you need someone who can navigate the modern world. I doubt you've traveled much beyond this valley. Isaiah hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. Very well, but we leave immediately. Every day that passes, Jeremiah gets closer to whatever he's seeking. And if you find this pond, this entity? Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. What then? Isaiah's expression darkened. Then I bring my brother home, by whatever means necessary. The curse has taken enough from our family. The journey east. The journey east was arduous, even with the convenience of railways. Thomas and Isaiah traveled day and night, changing trains in Chicago, then again in Pittsburgh, finally disembarking at a small station in western Virginia that served as the gateway to the mountainous region they sought. Throughout the journey, Isaiah experienced 2 more episodes similar to the one at dinner, moments when an ancestral voice seemed to speak through him, providing additional clues about the pond's location. The water is black but reflects true, he had intoned during one such episode. The trees grow inward toward the center. Birds will not sing there, nor will beasts drink. It is a place outside of place, a time outside of time. As they hired horses in the small Virginia town and prepared to venture into the wilderness, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on how his life had come full circle. 20 years earlier, he had been a country doctor riding into the Appalachian Mountains to attend a birth. Now, nearing 60, he was heading into similar terrain in search of the child he had delivered. A child who had been born old and was now a young man, and who might hold the key to a mystery that defied medical science. The region was sparsely populated, with small farming communities and logging operations scattered among the dense forests and rolling hills. Thomas and Isaiah stopped at these settlements, asking discreetly if anyone had seen a young man matching Jeremiah's description. At a crossroads general store, they finally found someone who had. "Odd fella," the storekeeper recalled, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Came through about 2 weeks back. Handsome young man, but his eyes had an old look to them, if you know what I mean. Bought supplies for a long stay in the woods: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition. Asked strange questions about local legends, old native sites, places folks don't go." "Did he say where he was headed?" Thomas asked. The storekeeper shook his head. "Not directly, but he was mighty interested in the Devil's Teacup." "The Devil's Teacup?" Isaiah repeated. "It's what locals call a place deep in the mountains," the man explained. "A valley where 3 creeks meet in a perfect circle of water. Strange place, unnaturally still, they say. Fish won't live in it. Some claim it changes size with the phases of the moon. Old-timers won't go near it, say it's bad luck. The natives avoided it too way back when." Thomas and Isaiah exchanged meaningful glances. This had to be the place Jeremiah was seeking, the modern manifestation of the pond where Absalom had encountered the entity. "Can you direct us there?" Thomas asked. The storekeeper seemed hesitant. "Don't rightly know if I should. It's dangerous country, easy to get lost, and there's bears, mountain lions. Plus, like I said, folks hereabouts consider it bad luck." Isaiah stepped forward, placing several gold coins on the counter, far more than information would typically cost. "We need to find our friend," he said simply. "He may be in trouble." The storekeeper's reluctance evaporated at the sight of the gold. He drew them a crude map on a piece of brown paper, marking the trail that would lead them to the Devil's Teacup. "Follow the north fork of the creek for about 8 miles, he instructed. "When you come to a lightning-struck oak that looks like a hand reaching up from the ground, turn east into the hills. Another 4 miles or so, you'll come to a ridge overlooking the valley. Can't miss the teacup from there, perfectly round, like someone took a giant spoon and scooped out the earth." As they prepared to leave, the storekeeper called after them. "If you do find your friend, tell him to be careful. Last fella who spent too much time at the teacup came back. Changed. Claimed he'd seen things no man should see. Hanged himself a week later." With this ominous warning echoing in their minds, Thomas and Isaiah set off into the wilderness. The Devil's Teacup. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they followed the creek deeper into the mountains. The forest here was old primeval, almost with towering oaks and pines creating a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight, giving the woods an eternal twilight quality. The underbrush was thick, forcing them to dismount frequently to lead their horses through particularly dense patches. As the storekeeper had predicted, they found the lightning-struck oak near the end of the first day, a massive, ancient tree split down the middle by some long-ago storm, its shattered trunk indeed resembling a skeletal hand reaching skyward. They made camp nearby, neither man suggesting they continue in the fading light. That night, as they sat beside their small fire, Isaiah experienced his most severe episode yet. He had been mid-sentence, discussing their plans for the following day, when his body went rigid, his eyes rolled back, and when he spoke, it was with the voice of a very young child. "The circle is nearly complete," he whispered, the childish voice incongruous coming from his middle-aged appearance. 7 times 7 sons, and the door will open both ways. What was given can be returned, but the price remains the same. Blood called it forth, only blood will send it back." Thomas watched helplessly as Isaiah's body convulsed, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. This was far more violent than previous episodes, more seizure than possession. When it finally subsided, Isaiah lay unconscious, breathing shallowly. Using his medical kit, Thomas tended to the young man as best he could in the wilderness, bathing his forehead with cool water from the creek and monitoring his pulse throughout the night. By dawn, Isaiah had regained consciousness, but was weak and disoriented. "We should go back," Thomas suggested, concerned by Isaiah's pallor and trembling hands. "Your condition is worsening the closer we get to this place. If it affects you this severely, what might it be doing to Jeremiah, who's been experiencing these episodes longer?" "No," Isaiah insisted, struggling to his feet. "We're too close. Jeremiah needs us, needs me. The episodes are proof of that. The ancestral memories are trying to warn us, to prepare us. Or they're being triggered by proximity to whatever caused your family's condition in the first place," Thomas countered. "This could be a physiological reaction to an environmental factor, something in the water, the soil, the air around this devil's teacup." Isaiah smiled faintly, still trying to find a scientific explanation. "Doctor, after all you've witnessed?" Thomas had no answer. The truth was, he no longer knew what to believe. His scientific training told him there must be a rational explanation for the Ashwood condition, yet his experiences over the past 20 years had forced him to consider possibilities that no medical textbook could explain. They continued eastward as the storekeeper had directed, moving more slowly due to Isaiah's weakened state. By midday, they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, and there it was, just as described, a perfectly circular body of water nestled among the mountains, its surface unnaturally still, reflecting the sky above with mirror-like precision. From their elevated vantage point, the resemblance to a teacup was clear, a round depression in the earth filled with dark water. But what truly caught their attention was the small figure sitting on the shore of this strange pond. A young man, motionless, staring into the obsidian waters. "Jeremiah," Isaiah breathed, spurring his horse forward down the ridge before Thomas could caution him. They approached the pond carefully, the horses growing increasingly reluctant as they neared the water. Eventually, they had to dismount and proceed on foot, tethering the nervous animals to trees a safe distance away. Jeremiah didn't react to their approach, didn't even seem to register their presence until they were standing directly beside him. When he finally looked up, Thomas was struck by the change in him. The young man appeared physically healthy, perhaps 19 in appearance, handsome with the family's characteristic blue eyes. But those eyes now held an otherworldly quality, as if they were seeing beyond the physical realm. "You shouldn't have come," Jeremiah said, his voice distant, dreamy. "It's not safe. Not yet." "Jeremiah, it's me, Isaiah, your brother." Isaiah knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've been searching for you. Mother is worried sick." A flicker of recognition crossed Jeremiah's face. "Isaiah, but why are you here? You don't understand what's happening. What I've discovered." "Then help us understand," Thomas said gently, crouching down to meet Jeremiah's gaze. "We want to help you, son." Jeremiah stared at him for a long moment before recognition dawned. "Dr. Harlow, you're so much older. 20 years will do that to those of us who age the conventional way," Thomas said with a small smile. "What are you doing out here, Jeremiah? What have you found?" Jeremiah's gaze returned to the still black water. "The pond exists in multiple places at once," he said, as if this explained everything. "It's always been here and in the place where Absalom found it, and in a dozen other locations throughout time. It's a fold in reality, a place where different times touch." "And the entity?" Isaiah pressed. "The caretaker of moments that Absalom encountered?" "It's here," Jeremiah whispered, a shiver running through him. "Watching from beneath the surface, waiting for the cycle to complete. 42 sons have been born. 7 more, and a choice must be made." Thomas studied the pond with growing unease. It was indeed unusual, perfectly circular, with no visible inlet or outlet, its black surface so still it appeared solid. The surrounding vegetation seemed subtly wrong as well, the trees leaning slightly inward toward the water, the grass a shade too vibrant, too uniform. "You've been communicating with this entity?" Thomas asked carefully. Jeremiah nodded. At first in dreams, then in reflections, and finally directly. It showed me things, Dr. Harlow, the true nature of time, the patterns of existence. Our curse is not a punishment but a window, a different way of experiencing life. It's manipulating you, Isaiah said flatly. Whatever this thing is, it's using our ancestral memories to influence you, to draw you here. No, you don't understand, Jeremiah insisted, a feverish light entering his eyes. I've discovered how to break the cycle without waiting for the 49th sun, without requiring the sacrifice of all living Ashwood men. There's another way. What way? Thomas asked, a sense of dread growing within him. A substitution, Jeremiah explained, his voice taking on an unsettling cadence that reminded Thomas of Isaiah during his episodes. One life freely given now instead of many later. One Ashwood man stepping outside of time entirely. Stepping outside of time, Isaiah repeated. What does that mean? It means becoming like the caretaker, a guardian of the threshold between time streams. Eternal, unchanging. Jeremiah's eyes gleamed with an almost religious fervor. I've offered myself. Tonight, when the new moon makes the stars burn brightest, I'll enter the pond and take the caretaker's place. It will be freed from its long vigil, and our family will be freed from its curse. Thomas and Isaiah exchanged alarmed glances. What Jeremiah was describing sounded like ritual suicide dressed up in supernatural terminology. Whether the entity was real or a delusion, Jeremiah clearly intended to drown himself in the pond that night. Jeremiah, listen to me, Thomas said firmly, grasping the young man's shoulders. You're not thinking clearly. This pond, this entity, they've affected your mind. Come back with us. Let me examine you properly, help you recover. I'm not ill, doctor, Jeremiah said with a sad smile. I'm seeing clearly for the first time. The ancestral memories aren't overwhelming me. They're completing me. I understand now what no other Ashwood has fully grasped. We were never cursed. We were given a gift, but one we weren't prepared to comprehend. What gift? Isaiah demanded. Living half a normal lifespan? Being born old and dying as infants? Being forced to move constantly to hide what we are? The gift of perspective, Jeremiah said simply. To experience life's journey from both directions simultaneously, to begin with wisdom and grow toward innocence, while our minds develop from ignorance toward understanding. It's the perfect balance, but it can only be maintained if someone stands at the fulcrum point. He gestured toward the pond. That's what the caretaker does. That's what I'll do. It was clear that reasoning with Jeremiah would be difficult, if not impossible, in his current state. Thomas decided to change tactics. At least come back to camp with us, he suggested. Have something to eat, rest a bit. The new moon won't rise until tonight. There's time to discuss this further. Jeremiah hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but I will return here at midnight. My decision is made. As they walked back toward their campsite, leaving the ominous pond behind, Thomas noticed that both Ashwood brothers seemed to grow more lucid with each step away from the water. By the time they reached the horses, Jeremiah was speaking more normally, asking about his mother and the orchard, even inquiring about Thomas's life since they had last met. Over a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee, Thomas carefully probed Jeremiah's beliefs about the pond and the entity, trying to gauge how deeply entrenched his delusions, if that's what they were, had become. Jeremiah answered thoughtfully, his responses coherent and detailed, but unwavering in his conviction that what he planned to do was necessary and right. Think of it from a scientific perspective, doctor, he suggested, knowing this approach would appeal to Thomas. What if aging itself is merely our perception of moving through time in a particular direction? The Ashwood condition suggests that this direction isn't fixed, that the human body can experience time's passage differently. What I'm proposing to do is simply the next logical step, to step outside the flow entirely. And you believe this will free your family from the reverse aging condition? Thomas asked. I know it will. The caretaker has shown me. Jeremiah's eyes took on that distant quality again. The curse was never meant to be permanent. It was a lesson, a demonstration of time's malleable nature. But Absalom misunderstood. and so did all the Ashwood men who followed. We thought we were victims when we were meant to be students. Isaiah, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. If what you're saying is true, why didn't this caretaker simply explain this to Absalom from the beginning? Why subject our family to centuries of suffering and isolation? Would Absalom have understood? Would any human in 1704 have comprehended what time truly is, how it can be experienced differently? Jeremiah smiled sadly. Even now, with all our scientific advancements, we barely grasp it. The caretaker had to show us, not tell us. By cursing innocent children for generations? Isaiah's voice rose with anger. By forcing us to live as outcasts, to watch our fathers die as infants, to know the same fate awaits us? I'm not defending its methods, Jeremiah said softly, only explaining them, and now offering a way to end them. As night approached, Thomas could see that Jeremiah remained fixed in his purpose. The young man grew increasingly distant, his gaze repeatedly drawn in the direction of the pond, despite the fact that it was no longer visible from their campsite. Isaiah, meanwhile, became more agitated, pacing around the fire and arguing with increasing desperation against his brother's plan. Thomas knew they were running out of options. If Jeremiah truly intended to drown himself at midnight, whether as part of a supernatural ritual or a tragic delusion, they needed to prevent it. Yet physically restraining him seemed both impractical and potentially dangerous in their remote location. As Isaiah stepped away to gather more firewood, Thomas moved closer to Jeremiah. I respect your conviction, he said quietly, but I have to ask, have you considered that what you're experiencing might be a symptom rather than a revelation? That these visions and communications might be manifestations of the same condition that causes your physical aging reversal? Jeremiah studied him thoughtfully. Of course I've considered it, Doctor. I'm not a fool. But there comes a point where the distinction between symptom and revelation becomes meaningless. If my condition allows me to perceive aspects of reality others cannot, is that illness or enhanced understanding? But the sacrifice you're proposing, is it truly a sacrifice to exchange 50 years of constant flight, of watching my body regress toward helplessness, for an eternity of purpose? Jeremiah's eyes were clear, his voice steady. I've thought this through more thoroughly than you can imagine. I'm not acting on impulse or delusion. Thomas was about to respond when a strangled cry came from the darkness beyond their campfire. Both men leaped to their feet as Isaiah staggered into the light, clutching his head, his face contorted in pain. Isaiah! Jeremiah rushed to his brother's side as the younger man collapsed to his knees. It's happening again, Thomas realized, moving quickly to help support Isaiah. The seizure-like episodes, but worse than before. Isaiah's body convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back to show only whites. But this time when he spoke, it wasn't with the voice of an ancestor or a child. It was with a hollow, reverberating tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The cycle nears completion, the voice intoned through Isaiah's lips. 7 times 7 sons. The threshold weakens. What was separated begins to merge. Jeremiah went completely still, his face draining of color. It's speaking through him, he whispered. The caretaker itself. Jeremiah Ashwood. The voice continued, Isaiah's body jerking like a puppet with each word. Your offer is accepted. Come to the waters at midnight. Bring the one who delivered you into this world. Thomas recoiled. Me? Why would it want me there? A witness is required, the voice explained tonelessly. One who stands outside the bloodline but has touched its beginning. With a final violent spasm, Isaiah collapsed unconscious into their arms. The oppressive atmosphere that had accompanied the possession dissipated, leaving only the normal sounds of the night forest around them. Jeremiah looked at Thomas, his expression a complex mixture of vindication and fear. Now do you believe me? Thomas had no answer. What he had just witnessed defied rational explanation. Either both Ashwood brothers were experiencing a shared psychotic episode, itself a medical impossibility, or something truly supernatural was occurring. As they tended to the unconscious Isaiah, laying him closer to the fire and covering him with blankets. Thomas struggled to process what was happening. In his decades as a physician, he had prided himself on his scientific approach, his refusal to accept superstition or mysticism. Yet here, deep in the mountains, miles from civilization, he found himself considering possibilities that would have been unthinkable in his comfortable doctor's office. "Why does it want me there?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Jeremiah looked up from where he was bathing his brother's forehead with a damp cloth. "You were the first outsider to witness an Ashwood birth, to see our condition as it truly begins. You've documented our development scientifically, objectively. You're the bridge between our reality and the conventional world. And what exactly will happen at midnight? I'll enter the pond," Jeremiah said simply. "The caretaker will be released from its vigil, and I will take its place. The curse on the Ashwood line will be lifted." "And you?" Thomas pressed. "What happens to you?" Jeremiah's smile was tinged with sadness. "I will exist outside of time as you understand it. Neither living nor dead in conventional terms, but aware, purposeful." He paused, then added softly, "It's not a fate I fear, Doctor. In many ways, it's what I was born for." Isaiah stirred then, groaning as he regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on the concerned faces above him. What happened?" "The entity spoke through you," Thomas explained gently. "It accepted Jeremiah's offer." Isaiah struggled to sit up, panic flashing across his face. "No, Jeremiah, you can't do this. Whatever this thing is, it's been manipulating our family for centuries. You can't trust it." "It's not about trust, Isaiah," Jeremiah said, helping his brother to a sitting position. "It's about understanding what needs to be done. One sacrifice now or potentially many later. A purpose for my existence rather than the slow regression into infantile helplessness that awaits me otherwise. There has to be another way," Isaiah insisted, gripping his brother's arm with desperate strength. "I've spent years searching for one," Jeremiah replied gently. "There isn't. This is how it ends, how it was always meant to end." As midnight approached, a palpable tension descended over the camp. Isaiah, still weak from his possession, begged and argued with increasing desperation. Thomas, torn between his scientific skepticism and the undeniable evidence of his senses, found himself unable to take a definitive position. And Jeremiah, with the serene certainty of a martyr approaching his destiny, prepared himself with quiet dignity. A quarter to midnight, Jeremiah stood. "It's time," he said simply. Isaiah tried to rise as well, but his legs buckled beneath him. "I'm coming with you," he insisted, though he could barely stand. "No," Jeremiah's voice was firm. "You need to return home to tell Mother what happened, to care for her and for any children you may have in the future. Children who will age normally, thanks to what happens tonight." He embraced his brother tightly, then turned to Thomas. "Doctor, will you accompany me as requested?" Thomas hesitated, looking between the two brothers, one determined to sacrifice himself, the other desperate to prevent it. His medical training told him to stop this apparent suicide attempt by any means necessary. Yet some deeper instinct, honed by 20 years of witnessing the impossible, whispered that what was happening transcended his understanding of life and death. "I'll come," he said finally. "But Jeremiah, if at any point I believe you're in danger, conventional danger, I will intervene." Jeremiah nodded. "I would expect nothing less from my doctor." He turned back to Isaiah. "Stay here, brother. Recover your strength. If something goes wrong, you'll need to be able to make it back to civilization." With a final embrace, Jeremiah and Thomas set off toward the pond, leaving a distraught Isaiah at the campsite. The final bargain. As they walked through the dark forest, guided only by the starlight filtering through the canopy, Thomas found himself searching for words, any words that might dissuade the young man from his course. "Jeremiah," he began hesitantly, "I've witnessed your birth, studied your condition for 2 decades. I've seen things I cannot explain scientifically. But what you're proposing, stepping outside of time itself, it defies everything we know about the nature of existence. Most great discoveries do at first, Jeremiah replied calmly. Once, the idea that the Earth orbited the Sun rather than the reverse was considered heretical. The notion that invisible organisms caused disease was laughed at. The Ashwood condition itself defies what you were taught in medical school, yet you've seen it with your own eyes. But to sacrifice yourself based on the promise of an entity we barely understand. It's not just the entity's promise I'm trusting, Jeremiah interrupted. It's the pattern I've discerned from generations of Ashwood histories, from the ancestral memories I carry. This was always the intended resolution, one Ashwood man voluntarily stepping outside the normal flow of time to close the circle that Absalom opened. They reached the edge of the pond just as the clouds parted, revealing a sky blazing with stars but no moon, the perfect new moon night. The water before them was unnaturally still, reflecting the stellar panorama with such perfect clarity that it created the illusion of a bottomless void filled with stars. Beautiful, isn't it? Jeremiah said softly, a mirror that shows not just what is, but what could be. As they stood at the water's edge, Thomas noticed something odd. The normal sounds of the forest had ceased entirely, no insects chirping, no nightbirds calling, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as if they stood in a bubble of silence, cut off from the natural world. Look, Jeremiah whispered, pointing to the center of the pond. The previously still surface had begun to ripple, concentric circles spreading outward from the middle, though there was nothing visible causing the disturbance. As the ripples reached the shore at their feet, a voice spoke, not from any identifiable source, but seemingly from the air around them. Jeremiah Ashwood, Thomas Harlow, you have come. The voice was the same that had spoken through Isaiah, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but carrying an authority that made Thomas's skin prickle with primal recognition. I'm here as I promised, Jeremiah responded, his voice steady despite the otherworldliness of the situation. Ready to take your place as guardian of the threshold. And you understand the nature of this exchange? Once done, it cannot be undone. I understand, Jeremiah confirmed. I will exist outside conventional time, neither aging forward nor backward, maintaining the balance between time streams. In exchange, the Ashwood curse will be lifted. All males born to our line from this point forward will age normally. Correct. The demonstration has served its purpose. Humanity has progressed enough to begin understanding time's true nature. The Ashwood line has been the vessel for this lesson. Thomas found his voice at last. What are you? Some kind of deity? An alien intelligence? There was a pause, as if the entity was considering how to respond in terms Thomas might comprehend. I am a caretaker, a guardian of the boundaries between realities. What you perceive as time is merely one dimension of existence, flowing in a direction you consider inevitable. My kind maintains the separations between time streams, between possibilities. And you cursed the Ashwood family as some sort of experiment? Thomas couldn't keep the accusation from his voice. Not a curse, a demonstration, preparation. Humanity approaches a threshold in its development. Soon you will begin to perceive time differently, to move through it by choice rather than compulsion. The Ashwood line has been the harbinger of this evolution. Jeremiah nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. And now it's time for me to take your place, to maintain the balance while others of my kind begin to awaken to these possibilities. Yes, step into the waters, Jeremiah Ashwood. Complete the circle that your ancestor began. Jeremiah turned to Thomas, his young face solemn yet peaceful. This is goodbye, Doctor. Thank you for being there at my beginning, and now at my transformation. Please tell my mother I love her, and that I found my purpose. Thomas reached out, gripping Jeremiah's shoulder. Are you certain about this? Absolutely certain. More certain than I've been about anything in my life, Jeremiah replied with a smile. This isn't an ending, Doctor. It's a beginning for me, for my family, and eventually for all humanity. Before Thomas could respond, a shout came from behind them. Jeremiah, stop! They turned to see Isaiah staggering toward them, barely able to walk but driven by desperate determination. "Don't do this," he pleaded, reaching the edge of the pond. "We can find another way." "There is no other way, brother," Jeremiah said gently. "This was always my destiny. From the moment I was born old, I was meant for this moment." "Then take me instead," Isaiah offered desperately. "Let me be the one to step outside of time." "Impossible." The entity's voice reverberated around them. "Jeremiah is the 41st son. The number has significance. He stands at the fulcrum point between past and future." "It has to be me, Isaiah," Jeremiah said, embracing his brother one last time. "Live your life. Watch your children grow normally. Tell them about their uncle who found his purpose in the stars." Gently disengaging from Isaiah's grip, Jeremiah turned and waded into the pond. The water, black as obsidian, seemed to embrace him, swirling around his legs, then his waist, welcoming him rather than resisting his passage. When he was waist-deep, he turned back to face them one last time. "Remember," he called, his voice already taking on an echoing quality. "Time is not what you think it is. It's not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean with currents moving in all directions simultaneously. Someday you'll understand." With those words, he dove forward into the depths. There was no splash, no disturbance of the surface. It was as if the water had simply opened to receive him, then closed seamlessly behind him. Thomas and Isaiah waited, breath held, for something more to happen, for Jeremiah to resurface, for the entity to speak again, for some sign that the ritual was complete. But there was only silence and the perfectly still surface of the pond, once again reflecting the star-filled sky with mirror-like precision. Minutes passed, stretching into an hour. Isaiah sank to his knees at the pond's edge, tears streaming down his face. Thomas placed a comforting hand on the young man's shoulder, his own mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. "He's gone," Isaiah whispered finally. "Truly gone." "Yes," Thomas agreed softly, "but perhaps, just as he said, not ended but transformed." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first hint of light, the pond before them began to change. The perfect circle seemed to waver, its edges becoming indistinct. The water itself grew more transparent, losing its unnatural blackness. "What's happening?" Isaiah asked, rising to his feet. I think the pond is disappearing," Thomas said in wonder, "or returning to its natural state." By the time the sun crested the mountain ridge, what had been the Devil's Teacup was simply an ordinary forest pool, irregularly shaped, its waters clear and normal, with fish visible beneath the surface and water plants growing along its muddy banks. Birds sang in the surrounding trees, and a deer approached cautiously on the opposite shore to drink. Whatever otherworldly presence had maintained the pond in its unnatural state was gone, and Jeremiah with it. The return. As they made their way back to camp in the strengthening morning light, both men were silent, lost in their own thoughts. Thomas's scientific mind struggled to categorize what he had witnessed, to find some framework that could accommodate the impossible events of the night. Isaiah seemed to be cycling through grief, acceptance, and uncertainty. His brother was gone, but had his sacrifice truly freed the Ashwood line from its centuries-old curse? It was only as they were packing up their campsite that Isaiah gasped, staring at his hands in astonishment. "Doctor," he said, his voice trembling. "Look." Thomas approached, not understanding at first what had shocked the young man. Then he saw it. The faint liver spots that had marked Isaiah's hands, appropriate for his apparent age of 40-something, but incongruous with his actual 17 years, were fading before their eyes. As Thomas watched in amazement, the slight looseness of the skin tightened, the prominent veins receded, until Isaiah's hands looked exactly as they should for a 17-year-old boy. "Your face, too," Thomas confirmed, studying Isaiah's features. "The aging reversal, it's stopping. You're beginning to look your actual age." Isaiah ran his hands over his face in wonder, feeling the subtle changes. "It worked," he whispered. "Jeremiah did it. He broke the curse." In that moment, Standing in the wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, Thomas Harlow, doctor, scientist, man of reason, accepted that he had witnessed something beyond the reach of science. Whether it was truly supernatural or merely a manifestation of natural laws not yet understood, the effect was the same. The Ashwood curse was broken, and Jeremiah was gone. The journey home, the journey back to California, was long and contemplative. Isaiah's appearance continued to normalize, drawing curious glances from passengers who had seen him board the train, looking like a middle-aged man, and now saw him as the teenager he actually was. They fabricated a story about a rare medical condition that Dr. Harlow had successfully treated, satisfying most inquiries while containing a kernel of truth. Sarah Ashwood received the news of her eldest son's fate with remarkable composure. Like many who had lived with the Ashwood curse for generations, she had developed a philosophical acceptance of the extraordinary. When Isaiah demonstrated that he now aged normally, his face and body finally aligned with his chronological age, her grief for Jeremiah was tempered by hope for her remaining son's future. "He found his purpose," she said softly, touching the portrait of Jeremiah that hung in the farmhouse parlor. "That's more than many find in a lifetime twice as long." Thomas stayed with the Ashwoods for several weeks, documenting Isaiah's transition to normal aging and helping the family adjust to their new reality. He was present when they received confirmation that the curse was truly broken. Sarah's third child, another son, born the following year, came into the world as a normal, healthy infant, showing no signs of the reversed aging that had marked Ashwood males for centuries. Before returning east, Thomas compiled all his notes, observations, and theories about the Ashwood family into a comprehensive manuscript. It contained everything from his initial delivery of Jeremiah to the final inexplicable events at the Devil's Teacup. He presented this manuscript to Sarah and Isaiah, along with all the journals and records he had collected over the years. "What you do with this is entirely your decision," he told them. "Publish it, preserve it privately, or destroy it. The Ashwood story belongs to your family, not to me or to science." Sarah considered the manuscript thoughtfully. "Perhaps someday the world will be ready for our story, but not yet. For now, we'll preserve it for future generations of Ashwoods, a record of their extraordinary heritage and of Jeremiah's sacrifice." The final years. Thomas returned to Virginia, where he lived out his remaining years in quiet reflection. He never spoke publicly about the Ashwood family or their remarkable condition, honoring the promise he had made decades earlier. But he did keep one small memento of his extraordinary experience, Jeremiah's first journal, given to him on the day the Ashwoods left Winston County. In his final years, as his own body succumbed to the conventional forward progression of age, Thomas often found himself reading that journal, pondering Jeremiah's words. "Time is not what you think it is. It's not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean with currents moving in all directions simultaneously." On particularly clear nights, he would sit on his porch and gaze up at the star-filled sky, wondering if somewhere in that vast expanse, in some dimension beyond normal human perception, Jeremiah Ashwood was fulfilling his role as caretaker of the threshold between time streams. And sometimes, when the stars seemed especially bright and the night especially still, he could almost imagine he heard a familiar voice on the breeze, neither old nor young, but timeless, whispering secrets about the true nature of existence that humanity was not quite ready to comprehend. When Thomas Harlow died in 1932 at the respectable age of 72, his will contained an unusual provision. Jeremiah's journal was to be sealed and deposited in the archives of a major university, with instructions that it remain unopened until 2001, 100 years after the birth of a remarkable child who had been born old and journeyed toward youth, and who had ultimately stepped beyond time itself to free his family from an ancient bargain. Whether that journal was ever opened, whether its contents were ever revealed to a world perhaps ready to understand its implications, is a story for another time. But in a remote valley in Northern California, generations of Ashwoods continued to tend their apple orchards, aging normally, living ordinary lives extraordinary only in their historical memory of ancestors who had experienced time's passage in reverse, and in their gratitude to the 41st son who had sacrificed his existence in this reality so that they might live unburdened by the past. And perhaps, on certain nights when the moon is new and the stars burn especially bright, Visitors to that valley might notice something unusual, a young man with ancient eyes standing at the edge of the orchard, watching over his family with timeless patience before fading with the dawn. Just a local legend, most would say. A ghost story told to entertain tourists. But the Ashwoods know better. Time, after all, is not what we think it is.